On an average day, the world's poorest nations generally struggle, but the COVID-19 crisis may push them over the edge, rolling back years of painstaking progress. The UN's trade body, UNCTAD, says in its new report on least developed countries. The coronavirus crisis is unprecedented, but it does show the enormous value of investing in building something called productive capacities. Today we talk to one of the lead authors of the report, UNCTAD's Rolf Traeger. Rolf, thanks for joining us. Why are least developed countries in such a precarious position?
Well, the poverty and the precarious position of many, if not most, of the least developed countries, it comes basically from their lack of resources, from the fact that they produce their goods and services with very simple tools and with very rudimentary technology. So the level of productivity is very low. But to this adds the fact that they have to cope with very low levels of infrastructure. So what does that mean? It means that as much as 80% of the population in their rural areas do not have access to electricity. The roads to which they have access, you have big chunks of the population which are hours and hours away from any paved road at all. And many of them do not have access to running water. So under these conditions, it's very difficult for you to have a performing productive structure, to have performing and productive farms, factories, or even offices.
How has the COVID-19 crisis made the plight of least developed countries worse?
The ironic thing is that in spite of all of their shortcomings, they have managed to combat the pandemic and to take the precautionary measures, both in terms of health policy, in terms of restriction to movements, etc., pretty well considering their limited institutional capacities. But where they were really hard hit was on the economic side. So just to give you an idea, as a group, they were forecast at the beginning of this year to experience a growth rate in 2020 of 5%. Now this has been revised and the economy is forecast to shrink by 0.4%. In terms of poverty, it's now forecast that as a consequence of the pandemic, there will be 32 million people more going into poverty, bringing the total number of extremely poor people to 377 million people in the LDCs. So if you take this as a share of the population, it means more than 1 out of 3 people, as an average in all LDCs, live in extreme poverty. And this is abject poverty, and this is an absolutely dramatic situation.
How can building productive capacities help LDCs beyond the crisis?
Well, it can help by giving them, first of all, better living conditions, giving them more access to energy, to transport, to health, etc. But particularly in the places where they work, it can give them access to better technology, to better machinery, to make them become more productive and hence achieve higher earnings, and thereby they reach higher standards of living. They can better educate their children. They themselves, here I'm talking about workers in LDCs, both women and men become more productive, and so they reach higher standards of living. And this means also everything that goes with it, better education, better nutrition, better health. So this is, if they have better technology levels, if they are working with more sophisticated machinery, if they have a bigger number of enterprises working in their own countries, this will create the occasion for more and better jobs, which generate better work and living conditions to their population. Hence, they will be better equipped to face shocks like the coronavirus pandemic.
Thanks, Rolf. That's really interesting. Given your analysis, what is at stake for LDCs if we don't work very hard to keep them out of absolute and abject poverty?
Well, first of all, you have to think first and foremost for those people who are living in those dramatic conditions. I mean, their perspectives of living healthy and fulfilling life are very limited because they live under very, very difficult conditions, under very strong hardship. So this is very worrying. But also socially, this is likely to create all sorts of conflict, social conflict, political conflict, and which may go beyond borders. Because if you have such difficult living conditions, chances are that the possibility of civil war, of conflict will increase, that you'll have displaced populations, that is will increase the pressure for migration. So this means that the problems that you have in LDCs are not just problems of the LDCs themselves, but there are also problems for neighboring countries, but also for countries which are much farther beyond their shores. So the problems and the plights of least developed countries are not just their own problem, they are a problem for the international community at large.
We're a decade away from 2030, where we aim to reach our Sustainable Development Goals. How do the LDCs fit into this program, this Agenda 2030 of the UN, and what's at risk for them?
Well, you have to think that when the international community adopted this Agenda 2030 back in 2015 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, something which was repeated time and again, but also ever since, is a motto of leave no one behind. So, for instance, you have as the first Sustainable Development Goal is eradicate poverty. The second one is eradicate hunger. So if you're talking about eradication, it means eradicating both poverty and hunger all over the world. This means also eradicating poverty and hunger in the world's poorest countries, which are the LDCs. So if the world is serious about the SDGs, it has to be serious about reaching these goals also in the LDCs, also in other countries. But what's the stake of LDCs? Well, the point is that in LDCs is where the challenge is biggest for both for the countries themselves and for the international community. So if you have this situation where now more than 1/3 of the population is living in extreme poverty, how are you going to take them all out of poverty in the next 10 years? So this is a huge, huge challenge.
So what does UNCTAD suggest we do? What are the policy recommendations coming out of our 2020 Least Developed Countries report?
Well, we, in the Least Developed Countries report 2020, we address advice and recommendation both to the LDC themselves, but also to their partner countries, to that which is generally called the international community. Concerning the LDCs themselves, they need to go into a big push of investment in order to redress these infrastructure gaps about which I was talking a couple of minutes ago in terms of transport, energy, water, etc., but also to create employment for the population, because that's the only sustainable way of combating poverty. Second, these countries need to have very proactive policies for science, technology, and innovation STI policies, as they are called, they are not a luxury of poor countries. They are also crucial for these poor countries in order to raise the productivity level of their workers, thereby their earnings, thereby their standards of living. And finally, we tell LDCs that they need to increase the productive tissue of their economy, which means promoting domestic enterprises so that they become modern and efficient companies, and companies which are integrated amongst themselves, meaning integration within the country and not just integrated with the rest of the world economy. So that's for the LDC governments. Internationally, we recall the responsibilities that other countries, particularly donor countries, but also those more developing countries, and their responsibilities vis-à-vis the LDCs, particularly in terms of making a much bigger volume of financial resources for them, for LDCs to be able to finance the investment that they desperately need, but also to leave the leeway to these countries to pursue the objectives which they have set themselves. Technically, this is called giving them their policy space. And finally, we acknowledge that there are international support measures which are already available in favor of the least developed countries, but what we say is that they have to be broadened and deepened. And particularly one area that we call for action is in the area exactly of STI, science, technology, and innovation. There needs to be much more proactive and effective measures in order to spur the transfer of technology to these poor countries, to attack the core causes of low productivity, of underperformance of the economy, and of generalized poverty.
Thank you, Rolf. It's a difficult challenge and road ahead for least developed countries, but building productive capacities seems to be an answer. There's more in the LDC report out now and available at UNCTAD.org.